This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by New Left Review. New Left Review is a bi-monthly journal of ideas covering world politics, the global economy, social movements, theory, history, and culture. In the latest issue, Gray Anderson analyzes NATO's role in institutionalizing American power over Eurasia. Tim Barker and Aaron Benenov debate the global economy. Hito Styrol reflects on art making and machine learning. Ilya Budraitskis reconsiders the legacy of Lenin. And Alberto Toscano considers neoliberalism as a form of civil war. Subscriptions start at only $44 per year, which gets you 6 issues plus full access to the NLR archive dating back to 1960, featuring landmark texts by Theodore Adorno, Jean-Paul Sartre, Frederick Jameson, and Nancy Fraser, among many others. Subscribe to New Left Review. There's a link in the show notes. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. Sam Altman, chief executive of OpenAI, calls AI, quote, the greatest force for economic empowerment and a lot of people getting rich we have ever seen. But as David Streitfeld wrote in an incisive and very funny New York Times piece, quote, despite all the talk of AI being an unlimited wealth-generating machine, the people getting rich are pretty much the ones who are already rich. Altman's rosy proclamation that AI will transform humanity should be read alongside the fact that he said in 2016 that he was gathering, quote, guns, gold, potassium iodide, antibiotics, batteries, water, gas masks from the Israeli Defense Force, and a big patch of land in Big Sur I can fly to. In short, the people in control of our technological future do not seem to care about the rest of us very much at all. This episode is my interview with Meredith Whittaker, Ed Ongweso, and Sarah West. We will get into the promise and peril of AI and also just fundamentally what AI is as a technology, because it's a term that obscures more than it clarifies. But in significant part, what AI is the latest big tech attempt to not only protect but also increase the already giant portion of wealth accrued to the high-tech tip-top tier of the global value chain. It is also, in significant part, about their drive for a new Cold War with China and making a lot of money off that war. Today's big tech dominance over AI research echoes the U.S. military's control over science during the Cold War. It is not just an echo, however, but also a continuation of that Cold War system, given that the military and private military contractors are still very much driving scientific research. Big tech's fortunes, of course, were made from the privatization and commercialization of military-financed network computational infrastructures, i.e. the internet. But big tech for a long time had business models that were not largely reliant on military spending. Now that's changing as they join the ranks of those old school contractors, securing a growing share of profits from the military-industrial complex that allowed for their rise in the first place. AI is also about the religious-like belief in the so-called singularity, a mythic future where humans and machines merge. As Judith Butler told New York Magazine, the AI fantasy is, quote, governed by the perfectibility thesis, and that's where we see a fascist form of the human. AI, then, is caught up in Silicon Valley oligarchs' obsessions with living forever and in remaking the human race through positive eugenics, meaning reproducing a lot of new people that are like them, a project for these super rich people using technology to try to turn themselves and their descendants into superhumans. AI, like crypto, is about big tech fundamentally changing the subject, redefining our present and future problems, and in doing so, dictating their solutions. As Ongweso writes, quote, capitalists are desperate to look beyond the impending disintegration of humanity's ecological niche and the unraveling of already threadbare social programs to imagine something more hopeful and profitable. For those eager to usher in a better future, the private financing of technological innovation has long been a source of optimism. Concretely, the bundles of technology that have been dubbed AI are, in the hands of big tech, other capitalists, and the American military-industrial complex, all about exercising forms of social, political, geopolitical, and critically, economic domination. This was one of the central insights of Chapter 10 of the first volume of Capital, but also the genius of the 19th century Luddite movement. Namely, that the primary impetus to invest in and introduce new technologies on the shop floor under capitalism is a desire to justify paying workers less in the name of making workers more productive. In other words, to bring them under further control and scrutiny, to de-skill and discipline so that they will have less control over the production process. This discussion moves us away from both the AI boosterism and catastrophism and toward this mundane and very old reality, this longer history of computing, technology, and this perennial fight for control over the production process. Marxists once pored over careful analysis of Taylorism, Fordism, and changes to the shape of industrial labor. We should apply a similar analysis to discern these technologies, too. Before we get this conversation started, if you like The Dig, if you depend on us for ruthless criticism of all that exists, then you likely know that we put a ton of work into each episode, every single one of these interviews, and it's listeners like you supporting us at patreon.com/thedig that makes all that work possible. A contribution of any amount by anyone gets you access to our excellent newsletter. If you're a US-based supporter contributing at least $10 a month, we will send you a book or books in the mail, a Dig tote bag, or a Dig mug. We can also send ebooks to anyone, pretty much anywhere in the world. If you are a dedicated listener and you can afford a monthly contribution, please make one now. We pay well nothing because we want everyone to be able to listen to every episode, regardless of your ability to pay. Your contributions, those of you who can afford to contribute, that is what makes this model possible. Hit pause, contribute now by clicking on the link in the show notes. That's patreon.com/thedig. Thanks. And here's Meredith Whittaker at Ongweso and Sarah West. Meredith Whittaker is a scholar and longtime tech worker whose work examines the political economy and social implications of computational technology and the industry that controls it. Edward Ongweso Jr. is a freelance writer based in Brooklyn who covers labor, finance, and technology. He's the co-host of This Machine Kills, a podcast about the political economy of technological innovation. Sarah Myers West is the managing director of the AI Now Institute and the author of the forthcoming book, Tracing Code, which examines the origins of commercial surveillance. Meredith Whittaker, Ed Ongweso, and Sarah West. Welcome to The Dig.
Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be here, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
This is an interview about AI, but I should start by asking, what is artificial intelligence? Meredith, you write that over the past decade, quote, tech companies quickly rebranded machine learning and other data-dependent approaches as AI, framing them as the product of breakthrough scientific innovation. When we call this bundle of machine learning technology AI, is the simple use of that term doing mystifying ideological work that we need to pick apart? What are the motivations behind this rebrand? What in other words do they mean to convey with AI, and what was the problem with that earlier machine learning brand?
So maybe I'll kick it off and then pass it along. And I think this is the fundamental question. We could probably spend 2 or 3 hours just unpacking this history and how this term has drifted across, different varieties of technical modality to describe more of an intention than a sort of unified set of technical practices. So as good readers of history, go back to 1956 and even actually before that, when the men whom we credit as, whom we're instructed to credit as the fathers of AI, rallied under this term. And John McCarthy, who is a cognitive and computer scientist, was the person who invented this term. And why did he invent this term? Well, one of the reasons is he needed a term that was attractive to funders, exciting, and could get them to fund a summer research program where he was going to, do some work in a couple, I think it was 8 weeks with some other guys, Marvin Minsky, Claude Shannon, kind of the forefathers, to make machines that think. And so he had to pick a term that would get the money. And anyone in academia is really sympathetic to this. You need a flashy term that you can also claim that like gives you some turf. And he picked this term because he didn't want to be associated with Norbert Wiener, under whose term cybernetics the field was organized at that time. So what are we looking at? We're looking at a need for funding, and we're looking at the petty academic beef and turf claiming, really familiar modalities to many people. So we fast forward through, we call them winters and, AI summers and winters, right? But it's basically like when funders were interested in funding AI and when they were not. And a winter is when they are not. And over the years, there have been a number of very different technical approaches that have been sort of clustered under this neologism. So, okay, that's a great history, but why now is the question we can then focus on. Why in, it was the early 2010s, did we see a sudden resurgence in interest of AI after the artificial intelligence or machine learning or these sort of subfields clustered under these categories had been effectively backwaters in computer science, right? Like these guys didn't even have their own lab. They certainly weren't getting big NSF grants. This was, a marginal field. Their conferences happened at like Hilton's in San Diego with like 100 people, right? And now you're looking at 15,000, 100,000, right? A huge, step function in interest, starting around the 2010s. And if fast forward, and what we're looking at around there is not a change in the fundamental algorithms or approaches to building AI. So what happened in the 2010s was not that, a bunch of geniuses came up and came up with an idea and we're like, now we have solved it. We're moving AI forward. Our techniques are newly relevant because there's been a breakthrough in, innovative approaches. The techniques that were being used in the early 2010s were actually from the late 80s. But what happened was you had, due to the surveillance business model, which sort of grew through the 90s and incentivized, these tech companies to create large infrastructures. So a lot of computational power, these data centers that span the globe and enable, high availability network computational tech. And the business model of collecting a huge amount of data that you can then effectively sell sort of, access and profiles to advertisers. It was those two ingredients that changed around the early 2010s, right at the time when the big, winners of the surveillance business model that, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Amazons, the Microsofts were kind of consolidating their power and, their kind of monopoly position. So the ingredients that were kind of new at that time were the massive amounts of surveillance data available to these companies and the massive amounts of compute, which through a kind of logic of brute force, were able to make old techniques from the 80s do new things. And of course, because you're talking about, commercial technologies sold by corporations that have the classic profit and growth interest, a lot of other things began to kind of cluster under this category of AI, because who actually knows what it is if it's hidden behind corporate secrecy and obscure technical jargon? So you had this, marketing bonanza where, you would have a spreadsheet formula on the back end that was sold as AI on the front end. You would have, various old statistical techniques powering systems that claimed to be able to make intelligent human determinations in domains where, these tech companies were trying to break into the market, that were actually not doing anything new or exciting, but had a newly exciting sort of mythologized marketing pitch that was propelling them forward and compelling I would say a guileless public to sort of trust these systems in new and I would say dangerous ways.
Yeah, Sarah, Ed?
I mean, I think one of the things that really strikes me is, what happens once this slippage around AI moves through the world. And what we're seeing unfold in front of us right now as a product of that history that Mara has really neatly painted before us is that, the sign of artificial intelligence can get laden with all kinds of capabilities and functionalities and a sense of like inevitability that belie the material infrastructure that underpins artificial intelligence, that belie the business model that underpins, the proliferation of artificial intelligence. So we start to get rhetoric around AI that associates it with progress, that associates it with, securitization and militarization. And that's kind of the space that we're now finding ourselves within. And it's deeply concerning because the material infrastructure underpinning AI, as it currently exists, is very much entrenching the interests of a few tech companies at the cost of all of these kinds of public harms that, we were talking about for the past decade, ramping up patterns of inequality, the deployment of AI for purposes of austerity, although it's sort of like marketed under, for different reasons. We're now in a moment where policymakers are considering different modes of intervention around AI, but without any sort of attachment to the concrete realities and incentive structures that are shaping, the way these systems are actually being deployed in the world.
Ed?
Really important here, both Meredith and Sarah have lined out and gone into detail about how the corporations have, every interest in presenting a certain image of artificial intelligence, and that this protects the power that they enjoy, the monopolies that they're trying to cultivate, the sort of products that they're trying to put out, as well as the path of technological development that they're trying to narrowly confine a lot of consumer products and business-to-business products, and military services and offerings to along lines that are profitable for them. And I think it's like we cannot stress enough how much of a victory they have had. Like in most of the discussions that we have when we're talking about artificial intelligence, we're talking about things as if they are able to think, as if they have interior states, as if they can predict or judge. And, we don't understand how human interiority is constructed, let alone how to replicate it, let alone if you could even prove, and that in of itself is like even a further down debate. Like, let's say if we, even if something, to entertain the AI arguments about saying, well, in the far-flung future, we'd be able to produce something and might be able to be sentient. We still also don't understand enough about intelligence to be able to prove it, right? So we're so far removed from that. We're at a point where what we do have is, you take large amounts of data and create predictive models and do statistical analysis to have something that imitates and plays the imitation game really well with human beings, right? And is able to ape around as if it ape around or be, tugged in ways that, still have the illusion of agency, right? But again, like I was talking about, even in that description, it still like ends up being boxed in by metaphors in ways that we talk about it as if there is some sort of interiority or independence going on, right? And it is, I think that's like one of the biggest roadblocks and victories on their part that is going to be incredibly hard to root out, right? How do we communicate that these things are clearly statistical, mathematical constructions and phenomenon that are not in any way, shape, or form intelligent, and that the gulf between these narrow applications of these models, which may have some practical value, to something that is actually intelligent, is such a huge gulf, and that because of that, there's been a lot of bullshit, and there's been a lot of lying, and there's been a lot of deceit that's taken advantage of that, because we've, for 40, 50, 60, 70 years, been imagining what the world might look like if we did have these agents or artificially intelligent actors present, right? But we haven't also been having larger, deeper thoughts about the way in which we use our language, what the implications and the possibilities are. And instead, it's largely being, the conversation has been steered, taken over, and controlled by people who have every interest to ensure that the resources, the internal debates, the assessments of capabilities, the resources to even push or, check work, infrastructure is in their hands and their hands alone, so that they can guide and the guided the path of development, guide the shape of the public's imagination, guide the curiosity that people might have, and make it nearly impossible for real criticism to happen in a way that's a disservice, because all we get is profit-driven, developments that are often used for ends that are practical again, but would be used for maybe helping accelerate the privatization of some municipal service, or being used to help provide more efficient killing machines, or used to provide more expansive surveillance networks, more lethal borders, but also robbing us of actual infrastructure and resources invested in actually understanding what intelligence might look like, and how human intelligence works and operates, and how it might be modeled, or what things are possible and not possible, right? I feel that's also another, huge miss, right? In that, we get this profit-driven surveillance tech, murder tech, a lot of technology that is driven towards how do we dispossess, how do we extract, how do we kill, how do we anticipate, how do we surveil, how do we buttress and reinforce social control, and a lot of energy lost. And how do we actually get a better understanding of intelligence, what it's capable of, what is realistically something that we're able to build, and what ways can we use these things that we're calling AI, not to replace human labor, not to displace people, not to kill people, not to surveil, not to corral, but to what some of the I think in some of their most ecstatic moments, or when they're really trying to sell it, right? The venture capitalists and some of the entrepreneurs will talk about, how do we augment human potential and capacity, right? How do we use this AI to make a better world, right? But when we sit back and look at what they're offering, that's not actually what they're offering. But we can't even really have that discussion, because all the discussions are really just code for how do we generate more profit, right? How do we improve productivity, and not any other concern that we might have. One, if these AI systems are even possible to build in the first place, and two, what would we want them to be used for if we can and do want to pursue their creation?
Breaking out the term artificial intelligence into its two component words, something that you touched on there, Ed, that I want to ask you all about is what sort of claims are being made by proponents about the so-called intelligence of AI. Linguist Emily Bender has argued at length that there's this huge misunderstanding at work that ChatGPT's capacity to mimic human communication is evidence that it has some form of human-like intelligence. And so is there some sort of sleight of hand here going on in terms of humans feeling this very human tendency, something anthropologists have long documented, to impute human-like intentionality and agency to phenomena that we find meaningful?
Yeah. I mean, we name our cars, right? We all want to be heard. We all want to be loved. We want to be talking to people. We want to be in community. We look up and the face we see is a parent or guardian as we're born, right? I think, this is not my lane professionally. I'm not a child development specialist. I'm not a psychologist. I haven't, dug deep into this, but I have studied Emily's work, and I see a lot of this just in the, as you said, sleight of hand vis-a-vis how our criteria is established, and sometimes how our criteria gets almost sort of degraded such that we can justify these claims. So if you look at the way that AI systems are evaluated, right? When you hear, you read Wired, or you see, some other headline about, GPT passed, is now better than humans at X task, or AI superseded humans at, I'm blanking on some anodyne example, but there are millions of these that make claims about not only, implicit intelligence of these systems, but that these systems are actually better than humans at this. And then you dig in and you're like, oh my God, okay, better than humans at what? What specifically was the evaluation criteria? And you will digging through sort of a rabbit hole of open tabs until you get to an evaluation data set in which, it's an AI system is judged on its ability to say, name, map the correct label to an image, and that is considered sort of, image understanding, or its ability to sort of get the right answer on a test that has sort of, rote answers. And you realize that these criteria, as scholars like Debraji and Alex Hanna and others have spent, have written about at length, the benchmarks by which we are measuring what AI systems do and how they do it are extremely narrow. These are effectively, in most cases, kind of tinker toy assessments that allowed academic models to compare themselves to each other. And of course, you need to be able to sort of validate your work against others in your field if you're going to make, claims about things like progress, if you're going to make claims about innovation, if you're going to be able to sort of organize a field of study, if you're going to be able to get tenure or money for your lab. So a lot of these benchmarks evolved in an academic capacity as basically a ruler that would let scholars sort of measure each other's work against each other. And then, through that slippage around the sort of, 2010 is the rough, kind of marker there, when these, marginal academic fields of study suddenly were sort of lifted up by a rabid tech industry to the sort of, core importance to the future of the world and its technology, these benchmarks came with them. And we have sort of slipped into, or we, the non-royal we, the plebeian we, have slipped into a pattern of being comfortable making claims about intelligence or capability, which when you dig into them are simply the sort of capacity of a model, trained with a certain algorithm to, do certain things against a very, very narrow criteria.
Ed?
Like you're talking about, breaking up those two parts is really important, right? Because, also at the end of the day, the artificial intelligence, what kind of intelligence you're reconstructing, it's largely, right, these devices, there are a lot of models that, Meredith has written about this, Sarah's written about this, about how the sort of consolidation of resources and infrastructure, has benefited greatly by interest that U.S. military has had in this, and guiding the development of artificial intelligence, or the industry, and the interest in what is artificial intelligence has largely been like, what kind of things can we construct that might be able to boost our ability to do surveillance? What tools can we use to boost our ability to kill or project power, or reduce people to units that might be better anticipable or calculable, right? That artifice, when there's this effort by corporations to present artificial intelligence as something that we're marching towards, as this is the end of history, by obscuring a lot of those origins, by obscuring that the artificial position of attempts to create these intelligent systems, or supposedly intelligent systems, is largely in ways that are surveillant and militarized and all about squeezing people, corralling people. It obscures, I think, what Meredith was just talking about, how deeply narrow it is. And I think also how most people, if they really, spend any time, or we're allowed to basically spend time looking at it, assessing it, thinking about like, okay, if I were to sit down in my life and think about if we're going to have artificial systems, structuring it and intermediating it, what kind of systems would I like to have? They would not consent to these sorts of things, and they would reject them wholesalely. But if you present it as, we are marching along, don't pay any attention to the artificers or the people who are actively investing resources into it. They're just digging towards, they're just digging through the shit so that we can find the golden nuggets, and the golden nuggets will keep leading us to this endpoint. It's not that they're steering and directing and guiding and limiting and blinding people to other paths and avenues.
Because it's inevitable that they're just helping realize something that always already was destined to emerge.
Yeah, we're just demonetizing eschaton. We're just giving birth to God. We're not really doing anything. We're just here along for the ride, right? And anyone who tries to get in the way of it, anyone who asks questions about it, anyone asks why, all the things that we keep finding in the pile of shit look like guns or cameras, that, these are Luddites, and these are people who are getting in the way of progress, right? And that is, I think, also like one of the, that's one of the worst parts, on top of a lot of the applications, right? Zoom back and you ask like what some of the early computer scientists were trying to do, and they're saying like, yeah, maybe we might have some computational system that might be able to imitate humans, like Alan Turing, right? But what should we use that for? That question, we don't get any part in that, to use the plebeian we again, right? No one except Except these people who have decided, we are going to largely use them for killing machines and control systems are directing something that, whether or not people want it to or not, will structure a lot of people's lives, and will structure their lives not because it's an intelligent system, or not because it's actually has interior states, and not because it's actually able to supersede human ability in a real general sense, but because there are billions and billions of dollars being directed at these things, and they're going to be applied in this or that way, right? And that's really the real thing that I think also is that's important to parse, right? By pushing this narrative of inevitability, by obscuring the artificial element of it, by obscuring that it's not really intelligent, you're able to just say like the outcomes that you might be uncomfortable with, the anxieties that you have about these things, the consequences that you're seeing and you're not liking. You just have to get with that, because there's no other path forward, right? We are just recreating human intelligence. This is just a reflection of what humans would do if we were a little bit more intelligent. It's a reflection of our system, and you also shouldn't question, why our system has similar outcomes if AI were involved, right? Things that we are generating that a lot of money and power is put behind are natural, and we're just discovering them. You shouldn't interfere and you shouldn't undermine.
Sarah?
When you look under the hood at a lot of these systems, it is a very messy picture. Mayor talked a little bit about benchmarking processes, and a lot of the systems that are out in commercial use are not going through any kind of like meaningful validation or testing. They're just kind of like releasing them out into the wild and then hoping that, as the public plays around with these systems, they'll find the bugs, and and the bugs coming in the form of like hate speech or, really things that exhibit safety concerns, and then they'll kind of like fix them in the edit. So I think like that dynamic is quite toxic, and it raises questions about the underlying power that the companies deploying these systems have, that they feel impunity to experiment in ways that are so detrimental to the broad public, and they don't need to, pass, basic level tests of scrutiny.
Hundreds of AI executives, engineers, and researchers recently signed a statement warning, quote, "Mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority alongside other societal scale risks, such as pandemics and nuclear war." Climate change, interestingly, not in that list. We're hearing a lot of apocalyptic hyperbole from the very same people who are claiming that AI is the future and the inevitable future, and who are, as you all have laid out, in fact, the ones actively making that future and also making a ton of money from that future, or at least the idea of that future. What is going on? Is this just a distraction from the more mundane threats that big tech already poses to humanity? Is it a flashy promotion scheme, or is something else and maybe weirder at work, something that gets at the tech industry's own self-conception?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is, these are arsonists selling fire insurance, right? These are people who like they really, Meredith has talked a lot recently about this. Like, if these people really wanted to, they could pause their own research, right? Instead, what they are doing is they are begging for regulations that just so coincidentally happen to privilege them as incumbents and protect their ability to continue doing the research and providing the products for specific entities or corporations or institutions, while locking out any possible competitors, right? And the fight ending up over who's going to control most of the infrastructure. But I think all of this is like also the people are crowing the loudest. They're also people who, if you step back and you say, okay, what are some of the risks that humanity faces, like concrete risks in the immediacy? There's risk of climate change, right? There's a risk also coming out of climate change of mass amounts of people being forced out of their, where they live, and mass migrations because of climate change. There's also risk of, conflicts suddenly breaking out and entering into hot conflicts, right? Either because of an accidental nuclear launch, or either because of escalation that comes from systems that might, be misinterpreted or have runaway consequences. There's a lot of risks that when you step back and you look, okay, well, what are some of the things we can mitigate, and who are some of the people that are feeding the risk? A lot of them are like some of these companies that are also screaming about the risk of AI, right? I mean, if who are the people that are making migrant crises work? It's worse. It's people who are selling artificial, and the systems are calling AI systems, right? That are making it easier for firms to terrorize migrant communities and also try to create deportation terror machines, right? It's people who are trying to offer cloud computing services to companies so that they can better find where to extract fossil fuels and get more of them out before their assets are left stranded, or before there ends up being some global, real global action on trying to curtail fossil fuel production, right? It's places that are offering weapons systems and trying to offer ways for drones to kill like a few less civilians, or to have more automated or algorithmic management of weapon systems or war machines, right? These are people who are contributing greatly to the risk of crisis and conflict in other spheres of our world, crowing about something that they stand to make a lot of money on, and that they're realizing there's a possibility for government action and other corporate action to curtail the possibility of those, untold profits if they're able to successfully pitch AI with a marketing strategy that is both, this is so scary, buy more while you can, and this is so scary, block anyone else from making it and make us your preferred vendor, right? And so it's really like the industry is the real threat here. The industry is where a lot of these threats and risk are coming from. The various dynamics and relationships and arrangements that drive what they produce, what they develop, what they are interested in, and what they pursue and how they do it, are what are going to keep generating from them more products and more services that threaten human livelihood. It's not going to be the AI systems itself. It's, the people who are sitting down, building this, that, and other products that are right now, making the world a worse place.
I completely co-sign what Ed said. And I think just sort of stepping back and looking at a recent history, and this is something that I know, Sarah and I worked together and sort of went through this period as folks who were focusing on AI, focusing on the discursive deployment of this term artificial intelligence, and looking particularly at the corporate consolidation of power around these systems. So what we saw was, again, early 2010s, around 2012, there were events that were heralded as AI breakthroughs, which were effectively, again, the product of this sort of, being able to scale the data and scale the compute to make old techniques do new things. And that led to this sort of first feeding frenzy and AI hype. So around like 2014, 2015, it was I think a little quieter, but for people in the tech industry or focused on, these broader issues, it was certainly kind of a riotous, new focus on AI. Everyone inside Google, where I was working at that time, needed to somehow bolt machine learning or, some AI variant onto their product to get, promotion. There was a real sort of rallying around this, and similar narratives around superintelligence, around these sort of baseless, inflated claims about the capabilities for these systems that were to some extent beat back by, critical scholarship and a focus on, the material reality of these systems and what have you. And so for the past decade or more, there has actually been a fair amount of focus on regulation, on how do we grapple with these systems? How do we grapple with the fact that at the moment, there are only a handful of corporations in the world based in China and the US who have the capabilities to develop these large scale models like GPT that are now being deployed through variegated markets to make decisions and predictions that are affecting people's lives, often invisibly, right? Like, what do we do about this? So there are longstanding policy processes underway. And in fact, Europe just passed the AI Act. So, what is happening now that we're seeing this sort of, again, like, the sort of AI mythology on steroids? Well, Chat GPT dropped in January. And I do think through this sort of, ability to let people experience an interface and the simulation of a sentient interlocutor and all of the things that we discussed and that Emily Bender has researched, there was a kind of renewed opportunity for hype that presented. And I think there was a tactical move, at least on the part of some of the people who are kind of elevating this perspective, which is, there is regulation that is going to happen. And we want that regulation to be favorable, as Ed said, to entrench our position. So what we need to do is very quickly reframe the problem. And the problem is no longer, the fact that these systems work for some to consolidate power while they are used on others in ways that are exploitative or biased or extractive or what have you. The problem is not that they replicate histories of social inequality and often deepen these, via the training data and via the way that they're deployed. The problem is not the consolidation of unaccountable power in the hands of a few surveillance corporations. The problem is that 50 years from now, these machines might come alive. And we're going to have to deal with that, right? So, if you frame the problem in kind of classic policy tactician, as a kind of classic move to try to capture a policy process, you also get to frame the solution. So you have companies like Microsoft, which, we should be referring to Microsoft instead of OpenAI, because Microsoft is a subsidiary of OpenAI. And that is the relationship there. But Microsoft is very intent on, their business is going to be selling access to AI APIs through their cloud services, Azure. And that's their first contract was like, Bain Capital and Coca-Cola for, licensing GPT, and, very distinct from their, humanity saving or humanity damning kind of rhetoric on the marketing side. But what they want is to leave that lane open. They want to be able to sell as many of those contracts, get as much money, and sort of, probably, aiming for large military contracts, all of that. And they want to stay away from, regulation that touches those material conditions. So, I think this is an incredibly convenient narrative, which both attributes to them the capability of creating God and, reframes the problem of something that is sort of both exciting, like catnip for elder male politicians who love to think about sort of a fantasy Cold War scenario, and distracts from, what's really happening, giving them an opportunity to capture or push back on that process. And I'd actually love to hear from Sarah around some of the EU lobbying that we've seen, which I think just drives this point home.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, there was such a significant uptick of corporate lobbying that took place around the AI Act. And to Mare's point, the reframing around like existential risk, these like potential harms far out into the future also, sets up, a Microsoft vice president on a panel saying, well, we don't have evidence of the harms. We don't have evidence of whether they've occurred. So like maybe we don't need regulatory intervention, belying the decades worth of evidence that folks across the research community and, organizers and, workers have been amassing for years and years and years of the ways that the deployment of AI is impacting their lives in the here and now, like in the immediate surroundings around us. But I mean, in the AI Act, you have this really odd positioning where companies like Microsoft, like OpenAI are both saying, we welcome regulation, but then as soon as you get down into the details, they back way off. And there was an article in Time, I think yesterday, that spoke to OpenAI's lobbying behind the scenes to effectively water down the provisions of the AI Act, even as it was saying regulation was badly needed. So there's just kind of this ratcheting back and forth on industry positions, exactly as they're trying to almost like slalom around what kinds of interventions are going to, ultimately impact their business model. And part of why this is taking place is because there are some regulators right now who might intervene. Like we're in a moment where there are people who are in enforcement agencies who, unlike the past couple of decades, have like largely been very hands off with tech companies. There's now, like their foot is a little bit on the gas pedal, and just that little bit of pressure is causing this, onslaught of corporate funding that's trying to lobby to shape the trajectory of regulatory intervention. And it is exactly because regulatory friction, it sort of like takes all of the wind out of arguments that AI is inevitable, that there is, an inertia or this like inevitable progress to AI, because regulatory friction actually can very much shape the incentive structures and the capacities of AI systems as they're, being deployed out in the world.
Is part of what's happening the noise, the sound and fury, the self-promotion, all of the apocalyptic worrying, is it a sort of side effect or knock-on effect of this earlier, very recent moment of tech optimism about the metaverse suddenly just fading, and with it fading, all of that hype and funding now just moving to AI? I just follow this from a sort of, pedestrian generalist reading the newspaper way, but it seems like the metaverse just became this enormous next big thing that will change everything. Over the past year and a half or two, it was, I think, late 2021 that Facebook became Meta, and already everything, it's so quickly deflated. Is AI really in part a financial psychological technology in a sense, something that can, they hope at least, sustain rising market valuations that the industry depends upon, priming the investment pumps in a moment when low interest rates have caused this huge economic crunch across Silicon Valley?
I'm going to offer a quick, steaming hot heterodox take on that. I don't think the metaverse was ever very serious. I saw the metaverse announced in a pretty haphazard way with almost no technological development actually done at exactly the time when Facebook was like, they were scrambling to try to avoid antitrust scrutiny. They were implicated in genocide, like saying the name Facebook had to be followed by vomiting or you weren't, participating in social life correctly. Like, they have no morally redeeming story about themselves. And I saw the metaverse as a very expensive distraction. And of course they dropped
the avatars
it, right?
didn't have legs. That was the real tell.
Right. But I think I would love to hear from Ed on this too, because I do think there's a way that venture capital investment as a form requires hype and doesn't care if that hype is real or not. You hype it until the acquisition or the IPO, and then you cash out, right? There's Theranos got caught, but most of them work on that premise. And then of course you had the crypto hype where just all, I won't go into detail, but again, similar, just like, drafting on wind with no substance. And what I'm not saying is that the metaverse and, crypto as in securities and AI are the same things fundamentally. I think AI actually has, in a very problematic way, a bit more staying power. It is a sort of longer history, and you can conjure a lot more by simply slapping a label on any old thing and sort of attributing to it these sort of magical properties. What I do think is that we're seeing that the hype cycle follows a similar pattern, because that hype cycle is almost conjured into being as a necessity for the investor class and the sort of financial engine of Silicon Valley. So I do think, what we're talking about when we talk about AI is like simply brute forcing compute and data. There are shifts in techniques, but not meaningful shifts. It's just like more and more data, more data. Okay, more data and compute. And we got to corner the market on NVIDIA GPUs because we need to be the ones who have that. But again, what we're seeing is a sort of scaling up of the requirements for concentrated corporate technology, not innovation. And so, why now, and, how this hype cycle sort of kicked off, I think has a lot to do with the financial instruments that govern, computational tech than with, as much to do with that as anything else.
I think Facebook is really actually a really great example of thinking through something like this, right? Facebook is widely used in the United States and across the entire world. It offers a service that also has other components that it's facing antitrust scrutiny for, right? WhatsApp, Instagram, that also have huge use out overseas as well. It has at various times attempted to get into other lines of service that kind of pull in more and more of people's daily life and communication, right? So attempts to either offer transfers or a financial services platform on top of its communications and, of course, on top of its advertising platform, right? And most of these have, in one way or another, not yielded the gush of profits that they've been hoping for, despite the money that have been poured into. And that has been the kind of more reliable predictor of when Facebook is going to look at a new business line, right? Advertising seems to be going through some trouble. Advertising profits seem to be, slowly declining or not growing as much as before. We're going to spend $100 billion on the metaverse. We weren't able to launch our own cryptocurrency coin that was going to be used as an attempt to get people to be trading US dollars after they traded into our coin on our platform and do more purchases and grow commerce on it, and also use this to further generate and grow advertiser revenue. We'll find some other business line. Maybe we'll get into wearables. Maybe we'll get into augmented reality or virtual reality, right? There is always a constant search for more, even when what you have is clearly a juggernaut, right? This is a company that, when it was growing less than the previous quarter, right, it had not grown. It had not gained, like $10 billion in additional revenue in the previous quarter at one point. I think it was last year, and saw a huge tank in its market capitalization, right? There was a moment last year when it lost about $800 billion in market capitalization because advertiser profits were not growing consistently or larger than the previous quarters, each quarter throughout that year, right? But this is still a company that commands billions of eyeballs. This is a company that still pulls in hundreds of billions of dollars, right? All that has really changed is people have to mark down estimate of the return by a few percentage points here, right? And I think that's, those few percentage points can then be used to transform this narrative about, Facebook is no longer able to command the imaginations of people, or it's not able to offer a product that will revolutionize how we communicate and socialize with one another. But at the end of the day, what it really is like Facebook is an advertising platform that is trying to figure out more products that will generate revenues through that. And sometimes that's using them for surveillance, sometimes that's using them for Second Life, sometimes that's using them for cryptocurrency. And its failure to do that is not going to stop it from doing it. And it will get more frenzied and desperate about it. It will find ways to fight regulators on it. It will find a way to corral or find regulatory loopholes in other countries where it can experiment with it. It will find other hype cycles to pull in, like it did with cryptocurrency, like it's doing with virtual reality, like it's doing with artificial intelligence, right? Regardless of whether there's an actual there. And I think that is general function of how a lot of the money sloshing around in the valley was operating when there were low interest rates, when there was a lot of foreign capital coming in from Japan through SoftBank, through Saudi Arabia and its Gulf city states and protectorates, and also through other countries throughout the world, authoritarian regimes that are looking to export or trying to find a place to slosh around their money, places that are also trying to replicate their own Silicon Valley, right? These attempts to build other homes for capital to come and sink and soak up and burn, as well as places where people to get some of that capital or to offer some bullshit tech, right, and to help sustain the hype cycle. This is, I think, a really important and underrated feature of Silicon Valley, that a lot of the development, a lot of the push, a lot of the hype is also self-interested, because people do understand part of what you have to do to keep the party going is to buy in, right? Investors will buy into rounds or throw as much money as possible at rounds to try to inflate the valuation and also try to get a better deal. They'll try to entice other people to get into, darlings in their portfolios. They'll try to get into, deals with charismatic and young entrepreneurs, whether or not they actually have anything right behind them. They'll invest in friends. They'll invest in friends of friends. They'll keep the money within the tight insular network and get it outside of the tight insular network when it will make everyone in the tight insular network richer, or when it will sustain the party that everyone in that tight network relies upon, right? And that ends up being, the desire for profit, the desire to keep enriching and passing around lottery tickets between a narrow group of venture capitalists, this desire to try to find something that might also be so stupendous that you might get a real profit from it, drive a lot of these hype cycles more than an actual development in the technology that might, be a breakthrough, which we haven't been seeing, right? We haven't been seeing, what is it, 10, 15 years since the advent of cryptocurrency. And we haven't really seen any of these cryptocurrency exchanges, and a lot of these applications and services provide uses outside of heavily financialized ones, outside of remittances, outside of financial services, outside of, in one way or another, grafting onto the speculative value of the underlying coin onto a good or service. Even though we know that they're possible and that there are some possible uses or applications of blockchain technology that might be interesting if you take away the speculative asset or take away the speculative value.
But it's revealing that none of those have really come about.
Yeah, right. Similarly with augmented and virtual reality, right? Maybe you could, if you twisted my arm, I could think of a way that it would be useful or interesting outside of Second Life or outside of the persistent ads that follow you around, right?
Surveilling workers.
Right, yeah, surveilling workers. Yeah. They're also, in these cases, they're
surveilling people in their cars.
For these people, there are a lot of, those are really good uses, right? If you want to figure out exactly what your work's doing, maybe you want to crush union organizing, maybe you want to come up with a bullshit reason to help furnish layoffs that you're going to be doing. Those are great things to do as well. Or maybe you're trying to figure out where a leak came from, so on and so forth, right? And for artificial intelligence, there's a lot of great use cases for people who are interested in, similarly trying to generate vibe, trying to generate profits, trying to extract the money, but not actually build something which has some social utility that is lacking in the crypto, that's lacking in the meta, that's lacking in so much of what venture capitalists put their money behind in the first place.
Doesn't have to work as advertised to work as intended, when we understand intended as sort of continuing to increase profit and growth.
Sarah, anything to add?
I think that's absolutely the case. And I think, one of the things that we see happen frequently within the AI industry too is that, a thing might be developed for one purpose and then put to a completely different purpose than is intended, that there's these secondary use cases. And often it's that move to the secondary use case where you see a lot of slippage in the actual functioning of the system, where it starts to sort of float in a way where it works as intended, but it doesn't work. And I can think of so many examples of this. One is this company that Mara and I spent a lot of time looking at back in 2018, 2019 called Affectiva, which emerged out of work at the MIT Media Lab to try and help people who are on the, this is the stated purpose. They were trying to develop a smile detector for people who have difficulty, reading the emotional state of other people. So, there's no support or evidence that says, a computer vision system's measurement of the micro movements in your facial muscles, one, can effectively measure a smile, and then two, that smile, imputing of a smile is a meaningful read of your inner emotional state. This is all pseudoscience, but it doesn't people will still believe it. And so they developed this system ostensibly for this use, and then, start trying to find a business model on which this system can be supported. And that's, the emotion recognition space, trying to figure out additional use cases for facial recognition as soon as facial recognition is in wide systemic deployment. So how can we make more money off of facial recognition? Let's layer on additional APIs. Let's layer on smile detectors and emotion recognition systems. And then cut to Amazon has its facial recognition API called Recognition. And they start selling it now, in addition to the other 5 emotions that we can recognize, let's add on fear. And they had this press release where they were Amazon Recognition now includes fear. And it was just this really bizarre moment where you see this slippage of the original intended use case with all of its flaws getting deepened and deepened and deepened in its deployment in ways that can cause widespread and significant harm. The Recognition API is used in security cameras. It's used in, by police forces It's used in ways that, disproportionately are going to harm communities of color, and the errors in the system kind of track across so many different layers and lead to, things that actually can meaningfully harm people's lives.
I see no reason why state authorities should not be informed if, their subjects are unhappy or afraid, and, identifying those individuals and following up with them.
Or if, some iCaliber's system has deemed them afraid. Because how are these systems built? Well, there's low-paid workers who label pictures of people based on their hunch about what that picture means about that person's interior state. So this is, again, this is straight repackaging race science and physiognomy in, computational clothing. But I think, yes, this is pseudoscience. Yes, this is wild. Yes, this is a multi-billion-dollar industry projected to grow. And I think something really important here is that what this system is doing at a structural level is vesting in a handful of technology companies and the institutions, governments, whoever is sort of licensing this tech. So your employer, the police, your school district, the right and the authority to determine your interior state, your character, your thoughts, your feelings with more purported validity than you have. So this is one of the more obviously problematic uses of this technology, but you sort of map on who gets to use these systems. Based on the business model, our understanding of how much these systems cost and the goals that these companies sort of have vis-a-vis revenue and growth, we know who's going to use them, right? It's not everyday people like plucking the AI apple off the tree equally and, thinking of creative uses. This is bosses. This is the studios, using these on the writers. This is, Disney using it on its, theme park attendants, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then in the, process of using this, what we're doing is, secreting more and more authority and more unaccountable power to both the tech companies who get to say, we developed the mystery machine that reads your mind, and whoever has the money and, structural position to kind of license and deploy those systems in the real world.
And that, of course, includes the military. And Meredith, you recently reviewed a book called The Age of AI and Our Human Future. The colon is placed very weirdly in the title of this book. But it was written by, The Age of AI, and Our Human Future. But it was written by quite a group of co-authors. Henry Kissinger, former Google and Alphabet CEO Eric Schmidt, and Daniel Huttenlocher?
Yeah.
I'm going to maybe not care. Huttenlocher, who's the dean of MIT's Schwarzman College of Computing. And the book is an exemplary text for the purposes of this interview for a number of reasons, but namely, as I just said, because of what it reflects about big tech's increasingly important role in the U.S. military-industrial complex, and really the even bigger and more lucrative role that they aspire to. We've touched on this a little bit, but why has AI become such a key lever, perhaps the key lever for big tech's effort to deepen its presence in the U.S. military-industrial complex? And how in particular did AI get caught up in this new Cold War with China? How does big tech sell itself as necessary to winning this Cold War, or maybe even a hot one?
I think I can, why AI, why now? It's the recent history. And if you tweet about this, there's going to be like 4 guys who come into your mentions and are like, actually, the internet was military, so this isn't new. But like, let's be real, the recent history after the kind of commercialization of network computation in the 90s and the development of this, surveillance business model that, left it up to technology, private companies to, kind of commercialize and own these systems. Following that, it was around 2016 when you saw the establishment of the Defense Innovation Unit X, and they stuck an X on the name to make it sound like tech because it was, I don't know, because it's like Google X or whatever, right next to Google. And this was, the folks who were very instrumental in this was Eric Schmidt and Ash Carter. Ash Carter, the kind of was an architect of, trying to bring the military industrial complex and the US military closer to Silicon Valley. There were a lot of reasons that they gave for this. We want innovation, we want to be nimble. How about an agile development process, but for military? But the real reason that tech wanted this is, if you're running a shareholder driven corporation, you need to find new ways to constantly increase growth and profits, right? You're talking about like metastasis, and at some point you have taken over the host body, right? Like, where do you go? So for Google, of course, and many of these other companies, Amazon had already been a defense contractor. There's sort of a different story there. But for these,
through the cloud, through cloud computing with AWS.
Yeah. Amazon was the sort of, had the first start on cloud computing, and effectively kind of, everyone's server is someone else's computer, because that's the ecosystem that's been built around that. But Google wanted a piece, Microsoft had a piece, but wanted more. And how do you get a piece? Well, you have to make sure that piece is available. So there was a lot of work done to kind of position AI technologies almost as the shiny object that would lead to these massive cloud contracts. Because what does AI require? It requires huge amounts of infrastructure. You have to run this stuff, and it's really expensive to run, and huge amounts of data. And who can do that? It's a handful of private companies. We don't have a government that has the necessary ingredients to roll their own in any meaningful way. So what you're looking at when you sort of celebrate AI is you're looking at a technology that necessarily would be provisioned by a handful of large companies and would come with large cloud contracts. And that's what we saw. There was my labor organizing started at Google around organizing against a Department of Defense contract that Google secretly signed to build machine vision technology for the illegal drone war. And it was a pretty successful organizing effort, because a lot of the people inside Google do have an understanding of this technology, knew that this was a terrible idea from any given perspective, from a technological rationale, that this stuff just doesn't work. It's not accurate. You're not getting intelligence. You're just laundering bad intel you have through a computer, to reasons like why are we allying with the U.S. military when most of the workforce is outside the U.S., et cetera, et cetera. But the Maven contract itself was fairly small, right? What they were aiming at was a much larger cloud contract. And once you've signed those contracts, you are a core dependency, and you are able to kind of increase your relevance and kind of the requirements for you. So I think that's a short version. There's a lot more there. I think there's a lot of mysticism around this, and there's a lot of lobbying that has staged a kind of China-US AI arms race as a rationale that is justifying pushing for bigger and bigger contracts. And why China-US? Well, there's only two countries that, for specific historical reasons, have these large tech companies that are capable of providing these technologies. There is no, and there's, because these companies and this particular business model function as a natural monopoly, you're not going to see others emerge. So this really is like, we want our companies to be the surveillance and death machine hegemons. We don't want their companies to be that.
Yeah. And just to pause to emphasize here in terms of Schmidt, I mean, people might know him from his past at Google, but his role is just wildly outsized, chairing both the Pentagon's Defense Innovation Advisory Board and the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, backing this thing called the America's Frontier Fund, a purported nonprofit that's about financing tech in an effort to strengthen American economic and geopolitical dominance, chairing this think tank modeled on a Henry Kissinger Cold War era think tank called the Special Competitive Studies Project. And yeah, he's just all over the place.
Yeah, he's very rich and very influential. And in fact, he was influential in the 90s, effectively writing the framework that enabled commercialization. And he was one of the people when at Oracle who was pushing on the Clinton administration to allow, self-regulation on privacy, aka to enable, carte blanche on surveillance. So he's also an old hand at this kind of influence.
Yeah. Ed, Sarah, thinking about like what is going on here with this AIs being wrapped up with this new Cold War with China, particularly, relatedly, this rapidly intensifying securitization of the geoeconomics surrounding advanced chip technology. To what extent is this simply about American economic dominance and, as Meredith was just saying, big tech companies wrapping themselves up in the idea of American dominance. So like what's good for big tech is good for America. Is this just about an attempt to impose permanent economic and technological dependency upon China? What's going on?
No, I mean, I was just going to say, like, this is very much like there is a reinvigoration of industrial policy framings that's happening before us right now. And it's not like the US-China arms race rhetoric, I think, is one front on which this is unfolding. I think we're also seeing this emerge out of the EU in some complicated ways in its relationship to US-based tech companies and its orientation toward regulatory interventions or not. And we're seeing this like shifting moment within the US as well, where there's a tension between this, tremendous amount of funding and political capital that's going towards the militarization of AI that's, largely bankrolled by Schmidt through a variety of different entities. And then there's this like sort of outpost within the White House that is like laid down one flag that says in the executive order on competition that national monopolies are not in the US interest. So there's like this moment of contradiction, but still within this like national interest industrial policy frame that's becoming more and more overt and is beginning to shape like the space for where the trajectory for AI development actually will ultimately go.
Yeah, Ed.
I think, one of my favorite things I think to point to is the original Surveillance Capitalism, which was this like monthly review piece that kind of sketches out some of the economic and geopolitical concerns the United States had coming out of World War II, right? You are coming out of it, with really historically unprecedented dominance in terms of physical security, also with like any possible rival powers largely being decimated or ravaged by the war, and in position to restructure the political order, economic order, financial order, so on and so forth, right? But also having a problem that, if you're coming out of the war effort, industrial productivity and output has, massively jumped. So how do you handle productive surplus, right? How do we plan or try to put some guardrails in the system, in the economy, and in the political system that can consume the surplus, recycle it, figure out what kind of global system we can also construct on top of it that will preserve the power and the hegemony, right? And the surveillance capitalism essay kind of sketches out like three, kind of hits that they want to do when they're interested in literally getting people, trying to get them to consume in specific ways and trying to do something of like an advertising revolution that, kind of incentivize people to consume certain things and certain trends in certain ways. And that's one way you can help contain and better plan parts of the economy. And that requires a sort of the creation of a surveillance and securitization apparatus that makes it easier to handle people in larger and larger masses and create infrastructure and ideas and techniques for doing that. You also need to create a way for the industrial production to be maybe tied to scientific innovation or knowledge production, right? And so creating an industrial warfare state is another development that emerges, right? Where you're trying to figure out how can we keep tight links between the military, between industry, and between the highest, the commanding heights of science and scientific enterprise, right? How can we? And one way to do that is, of course, make sure that people are making war machines, but also that the advancements that you're most interested in funding, or that you are making known that you have a huge interest in, are ones that have to deal with national security, that have to deal with interstate competition, that have to deal with power projection, that have to deal with all the things that go along with amplifying our power and securing our position in organizing the world, right? And so you have those two, this sort of imperial war machine that needs to be supported with organizations in the economy. You have a need to organize the domestic public. You also have a need to figure out what to do with growing power and centrality of finance and figuring out ways and places to soak the capital that's been accumulating, speculative instruments that you can be used. And again, just like with the war machine and just like with the advertising revolution or the communications revolution, you need to figure out apparatus and techniques for surveillance and securitization. And so I feel like that surveillance capitalism argument, we're in need of, or coming out of World War II, capitalism needs a few guardrails. They throw the public some bones, but they're also building up this really extravagant apparatus for surveillance and social control, and for also monitoring finance, knowledge production, and war or geopolitical ambitions. Have an even a growing and ever-growing need for surveillance and social control, and that one of the reasons why, this obsession with using computational resources for the military ends up emerging, and for large swaths of society ends up being because, after World War II, they ended up creating a capitalism that required huge amounts of surveillance and huge amounts of anticipation of people in ways that don't bleed into the mind control narrative of surveillance capitalism by Zuboff, but do bleed into this surveillance capitalism narrative of we are trying to both preserve domination of the world and prevent, broadly speaking, economic catastrophes or crises which might derail us, popular unrest which might derail us and undermine that, rival powers, and ensure that we are continuing to produce this, that, or the third, which might help us better achieve either of those ends, right? And AI and collaborations with Silicon Valley and tech companies have, over time, both been in close partnership and collaboration with these imperatives, and also evolved and designed themselves to fit them better or to push them further, right? In ways that maybe even state planners and industry planners might not have anticipated before, right? Where you have companies envisioning all sorts of ways that they can, collect data on people, or, like Sarah was talking about, discovering secondary uses of applications and services that might be very attractive because they break labor, because they help, ensure that workers don't have autonomy or control over production and over their labor itself. That are useful because they help maintain borders, because they're used to maintain homogeneity of community, whether that's by expelling migrants, whether that's by reinforcing apartheid, whether that's by ensuring that you can have like faraway wars with drones assassinations. Like it plays it has ended up being able to be reconstituted and constructed in very useful ways for power projection, for imperialism, and for our geopolitics, I think.
I'm Astrid Taylor, and you're listening to The Dig with Daniel Denvir, a podcast for people who want to deeply understand the world and organize to change it. That's why you should support the show at patreon.com/thedig.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, bringing you the Socialism Conference. No one is coming to save us but us. Grassroots movements for social change confront a critical juncture today. We need visionary politics, collective strategy, and compassionate communities now more than ever. You should attend Socialism 2023. Join thousands of activists, organizers, abolitionists, and socialists to learn from each other and from history, assess ongoing struggles, build community, and experience the energy of in-person gatherings. Featured speakers at Socialism 2023 will include Naomi Klein, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Robin D.G. Kelly, Angela Davis, Gina Dent, Erica R. Miners, Beth E. Ritchie, Mark Lamont Hill, Aja Monet, Bettina Love, Olufemi Taiwo, Sophie Lewis, Harsha Walia, Dina Gilio Whittaker, Astra Taylor, Malcolm Harris, Kelly Hayes, Dave Zirin, and many more. I will also be there recording a live episode of The Dig. The Socialism Conference is brought to you by Haymarket Books and dozens of endorsing left-wing organizations and publications, including DSA, Jacobin, Dream Defenders, EWOC, Debt Collective, the Autonomous Tenants Union Network, N+1, Verso Books, and many more. Visit socialismconference.org to learn more and register today. Register by July 7th for the early bird discounted rate. Hope to see you there. Meredith, you write that one thing that big tech does to, quote, co-opt and neutralize critique is funding and elevating their weakest critics, often institutions and coalitions that focus on so-called AI ethics and frame issues of tech power and dominance as abstract governance questions that take the tech industry's current form as a given and AI's proliferation as inevitable. If you all would, let's name some names. Who is the controlled opposition that we're talking about here, and what sort of critiques are these that they offer that end up serving big tech's ultimate interests?
Look, asking to name names when you're grant supported and then have to be like called into the same convenings with the quote unquote community that includes these folks is a risky proposition. Happily, I'm not one of those folks right now. So I would point to some of the work, earnest or not, of folks like Tristan Harris. And I think the formula there is pretty simple, right? And it's actually, in some sense echoes the Doomer X risk structure, although, is a bit more nuanced. But I think it's, there's a big problem. These are very, very powerful. These are mind control systems was sort of his thesis, right? And this is, again, kind of bleeds into Zuboff's work where you attribute these characteristics or capabilities to these systems that actually inflate their standing and reputation. Like, whoa, Facebook can control our mind. Well, which government wouldn't want to license that API? And then, propose a set of remediations that look something like turn off notifications after 5 p.m. or, use grayscale or, what have you. And so what you have is a narrative that has sort of, blown up the power of these systems in ways that are very beguiling, often sort of almost, verging on the religious, and then a set of remediations that does nothing to, actually address the core problem. And you see this formula not only from, the controlled opposition or from, folks who are, or whatever we're going to call them, the weakest critics. You also see this from some of the companies, right? And around 2017, 2018, you had Brad Smith at Microsoft, who's their general counsel. And, I would say probably the most strategic operator around this, quoting Orwell in the context of facial recognition, saying like, we really need to regulate. This is very dangerous. And a lot of the media fell all over themselves praising, the awakened executive who is finally willing to grapple with the power of these systems. Meanwhile, what Microsoft is doing around 2020 is undermining meaningful regulation that would actually, ban the use of facial recognition in Washington, right? Instead, they're lobbying for, I actually forget the details, but it was, significantly reduce what that regulation did, right? Proposing notice and consent, which is a meaningless formula for, actually sort of allowing kind of democratic deliberation around whether or how these systems are used. So there's a lot of power in focusing on the narrative of harms and then kind of failing to actually, meet those harms with any kind of meaningful remediation. There's also a whole kind of auditing industry that claims, it's kind of, they want to be the PricewaterhouseCoopers, but of auditing AI. So they'll just, go in there, they'll be your liability shield. They'll run a couple tests. They'll say it's not biased or it's not harmful or, make claims that, again, you can't really validate from that sort of perspective. And then that is, again, something that will enable these systems to be sort of deployed in the real world. So there's a lot of shapes to how that is done. And I think, Sarah and Ed can probably add many more to that list, or, maybe not name names, but you could sort of characterize themes that run through.
Characterize sorts of entities and people.
When Ed was talking earlier about the long history of surveillance capitalism and like the emergence out of the Cold War, One of the things that really struck me, that I'm like continually remembering this history, and it always like hits me over the head, but like a lot of movements toward, instantiating database computing and, like increasingly bureaucratized surveillance and control under the auspices of tech companies came immediately on the tail of COINTELPRO, of, Watergate. And there was this very different common sense during that period around government surveillance, around, what the impact of computerization would be on society. And so you saw much more clear agitation and organizing, including coming from, folks within the tech industry. And I'm thinking here of groups like Computer People for Peace, which started as an anti-war group, but quickly found solidarity with the Black Panthers, with, labor organizers and precarious workers. They were originally called Computer Professionals for Peace and rebranded themselves as Computer People for Peace in recognition that there is a much broader front than sort of like computer engineers, and like technical expertise is actually a form of asserting power that needs to be challenged. And there's a line through there, like from there to Maven organizing too. And so finding these moments when there is space for imagining otherwise, I think remains really important. And we've talked a lot today about mechanisms of power and control. And I think, just like for my soul, I also like need space to be talking about like liberation and resisting in ways that open up space for actually like meaningfully creating a different kind of world.
Yeah, no, I think, right. Yeah, you're absolutely right on that. I think that it is really important also to think about, how do we think about things in liberatory senses, and like also what's blocking us from doing it, right? Like, because the real question, right, that one of the main questions that we never get the opportunity really to do is what would we do with what would we do with a system of equivalent resources, but organized in much different ways along different principles, right? All of the systems that we have largely are done for purposes and ends and values that we, would have nothing, that we want to have nothing to do with, right? I think about, as this very small example of a consequence of how how easily it can get in the mud or become a problem is like, when you think about the gig economy, right? The gig economy is really, gig economy presents itself as a natural extension of delivery service, taxi services, food delivery services, when in reality it's an artificially constructed platform that uses algorithms to try to assign work in ways that's exploitative, but also keeps a huge surplus of workers, right? So so the algorithm and the digital sheen are artifice that obscure really insidious organizations of how people are going to relate to one another, and also how resources are going to be extracted from the communities and in the search for profit, which none of these companies have realized yet. When we are looking at whether or not we get the chance to talk about it, I think it also mirrors in the way where it's like partly because of the failure of a lot of the discourse to really gain and look with clear eyes at how we don't have artificially intelligent systems, and to kind of fall for the trap that the digital is like something really new and there's this sort of seductive, alluring, occultish, power to it, right? Fall for that trap. And for 10 years, what we got was largely non-critical reporting on the gig economy outside of labor reporters that have made something that still has yet to earn a single profit, probably, or threatened to be a permanent feature of most of their cities and countries, unless there's like a massive upheaval and rooting out, and a movement that manages to root out these companies, right? And reimagine what, if we are going to do online, digital, delivery or logistical systems, what would they look like outside of what these vultures and parasites have tried to establish, right? And similarly, right, we get robbed of like that sort of desire for having discussions about what liberation or liberatory pursuits might look like if we imagine them, because we've been dealing with, like, for a decade or so, people who similarly kind of buy into the histories presented by these firms, the rhetoric presented by these firms, the fear mongering presented by these firms and their marketing strategies, as they try to will themselves into existence, into being like permanent parts of the landscape that we can't do anything about, right? And I feel like, one fear I definitely almost always have is that, well, it's not that we won't be able to, but that root them out, because I do think, and like that's part of, that's why we're all here also, right? Because we do believe that we can get them out and figure out an alternative way to organize computational resources and figure out, what kind of society we want to be built on top of that, or integrated or intermediated by something like that. But that, as these things continue and as they largely are successful in restructuring or watering down and lobbying in ways where the laws gets oriented around their demands and their desires and their business models, right? That we are going to be permanently tainted, poisoned by their visions, and never really get to explore, what it could mean for us if we decide, if we, took control of and owned, and, in whatever form that might look like, all of the infrastructure that they currently use to restructure our lives, to make them more transparent and more legible and more profitable for them and more exploitative and extractable for them and calculable, right? And I hope that doesn't come to pass, right? I hope the taint is not there forever.
The hyperbolic boosterism and also the doomerism around AI, it often invokes this idea that it's a development akin to the discovery of steam power or even fire. Kissinger said, quote, "I think the technology companies have led the way into a new period of human consciousness, like what, quote, the Enlightenment generations did when they moved from religion to reason." And I have no clue what Kissinger is drawing on here with this sort of new age eschatological language, but where does AI fit into this almost religious belief in parts of the tech world that we're approaching the so-called singularity?
Oh, God.
A moment when human and machine I'm sorry, we have to talk about it. This moment when human and machine intelligence will essentially merge. What's up with that?
The perspective of the singularity is that secretly we all want to be computers, and that we're going to inevitably do that because of a bunch of locked in physical processes and development patterns, right? But there's been a lot of really interesting work in history done excavating it that I think more properly situates it as a history of Christian mysticism seeping in and structuring background assumptions about how we can create reality, right? Or how we can remake our bodies, right? There's I'm blanking on her name, but she's written a really great essay and book that also has a few chapters on this subject. And the singularitarians there, she kind of talks about how this idea, like, take the idea of the singularity, right? This idea that starts to gain real traction thanks to Ray Kurzweil, who's director of engineering at Google's insistence on spreading this idea as far as possible. And what he does is he's saying in the singularity we'll no longer be able to predict how fast the rate of development for the advancements of computational software or technology will be, because we'll fit so many transistors onto these wafers, and because we'll have so much computational power, and we'll be able to replicate human intelligence, and then it will modify itself, and then we'll lift off, right? This is just like a reformulation of this Jesuit priest Teilhard de Chardin, who wrote this book called Omega Point, and he had this really mystical conception of God, where he's like, okay, well, evolution, we can reconcile evolution with believing that God made the universe, because as humanity evolves and as our life evolves and our world evolves, we will create a network that encompasses all machines and minds, and that will give birth to something that will eventually be capable of bringing God into the universe. And at that Omega point, God will exist. And God will exist and transcend space and time. Go back in time, make the universe, causal contradiction avoided, evolution is allowed to happen, right? So it's a reformulation of that. Ideas about transhumanism, about recreating our bodies, modifying them, transcending the limits of our humanity, reconfigurations of old Christian debates about what will happen when you get resurrected and what your body will look like, what your mind will be like. A lot of these debates, a lot of these anxieties, a lot of these questions are repainted in a secular light, but they are tracing back to these older Christian ideas, and the concern there that singularitarians will insist that's not the case. It is the case, but the real concern there is that then you start getting into the basis for kind of maniacal utilitarian logic, right? If there's this idea that one, God's birth is inevitable, or that nirvana is possible, but you have to go along with a specific path of development to reach it, then that in one way or another not only justifies whatever you want to do to reach that path, but then narrows you into adhering to that path and saying prioritizing resources to help people in the here and now, right? To build certain types or resist to build certain types of societies in the here and now. It doesn't really matter, because we're talking about reviving and bringing back to life every human who's ever lived and creating a utopia for every human who ever will live far flung into the future, right? So I think the singularity, is thought of as like this kind of innocent, cool idea where, wouldn't it be nice for us to transcend the limits of mortality? But it's like this weird mysticism that allows for really horrid utilitarian logic to enter that justifies increasingly nasty, apathetic, or ranging from apathetic to, nasty and exterministic value judgments about what type of society and world we should build or tolerate. In the name of giving birth to God and making sure all of us get to sing in harmony forever at his feet.
And when you say utilitarian logic, are we talking about effective altruism?
I think the effective altruists come out of that strain of logic, right? They go a little bit further because they're really interested in formalizing this logic system, right? And trying to figure out what you should do in X situation and Y situation, what type of job you should get, how much you should donate, like what types of institutions, foundations, organizations are worth working with, not working with, what type of life you should personally live, and what type of life you should, try to push others to live. I think they're very interested in formalizing and articulating very clearly that logic, but that it nonetheless seeps and permeates at the background of a lot of this mysticism that has gone from occult to secular.
I've seen this logic emerge as marginal. It's been around, right? But it was much more marginal, and it's certainly gotten a boost in the last 5 or so years. I don't have a great take on why. I do think there's a real slippery slope, so to speak, when you start treating people and our world like quantifiable commodities. And it seems like there is a through line between sort of that perspective on our one magical life and our wild planet and the contorted rationalizing that leads you to think you can ignore any issue in the present based on a computationally guaranteed future in which those issues will be somehow remediated by a kind of a spiritual event happening when all people who were harmed now come back to life or what have you, right? It gets very odd very quickly. And I do think about JPL and Anton LaVey, there seems to be kind of this, people who are very invested in understanding the world computationally and weird ass beliefs that somehow sort of are like catnip for that type. And, again, this isn't my lane. I've just, been around these dudes for about 2 decades and that's what I got.
Yeah. Why do the Titans, just more like stepping back from the singularity, but certainly including it, why do the Titans of Silicon Valley believe such weird, insane, and dangerous things? What is it about being situated in the commanding heights of the tech economy that brings them into such close contact with the outer reaches, beyond the outer reaches of acceptable ideas?
Maybe it's just the heights, right? Maybe not just the tech economy. And
right.
Again, I'm out on a limb here outside of my disciplinary moorings, but in a sense, what I saw when I joined Google in 2006, right? There's somewhere around 3,000 workers at Google total. Yahoo is bigger than Google, so I saw this sort of crescendo as Google grew and as the tech industry metastasized and took on such an outside role in our world. And so you have a bunch of folks who are, at least at that time, there were a lot of just well-meaning nerds, right? And I was a book nerd, but I hung out with the math nerds a lot. And, there's a sort of type, right? They're just really into it. They point that laser of attention at anything and they got to go really deep. And I like those folks. And a lot of them were there and like just tickled pink because they got rich by doing something that was naturally interesting to them anyway. And, a lot of folks just stepped in and got super lucky, right? Like you were pre-IPO and then you're set for life. And how do you narrate that, right? How do you reverse engineer a history that makes you deserving of what you got in a world that is sort of, fraying in many ways around you? And, particularly how do you do that when, as you move through life, you're going to be surrounded, like willingly or not, unless you're real careful, with a lot of people who are, a lot of simps, a lot of suck ups, a lot of people who are going to say yes, yes, yes. And sort of then, I think it's very easy to do, what I've called like expert drift, right? You studied, electrical engineering and mechanical engineering, and then you learned network engineering and built some of like Google's internal tooling. But suddenly you are being asked to expound on issues like, medicine or education or, the future of industrial policy. And, people aren't looking at you as askance when you offer like an uninformed take. And I think there is a feedback loop that happens somewhere in that nexus that makes people very susceptible to, wild ass heterodox stuff, because, if I'm an intelligent person, something I think is intelligence, ergo it must be, correct. And I also think power corrupts your brain. I think if you do enough work to rationalize that, you just lose your ability to analyze with any integrity. And I've seen people get, I don't like using ableist terms, but like way less intellectually capable as they, in proportion to the amount of power that they have accrued.
Sarah, Ed?
Yeah, I mean, where I keep going with this is like, there is this constant refrain that continually sort of emerges across the history of the tech industry. And you can trace this back to like William Shockley, who was, involved in the invention of the transistor. This like continual flirtation with far right ideologies and with like increasingly authoritarian modes of control. That history, I think, is rarely brought to the surface in, cultural histories of tech, but it's always there under the surface. And here I'm thinking about like Fred Turner's work in From Counterculture to Cyberculture, Stephanie Schultz's work on, looking at the cultural history of cyberspace and how it relates to corporate control and state level control. And then there's this like deep vein that like continually resurfaces in Shockley, in McCarthy, who was really interested in ideas about population control. And sorry, I didn't say Shockley's sort of like obsession was very explicit eugenics. And he was funded by the Pioneer Fund, which was a fund that was established to support eugenics work. And then you can look at someone like Peter Thiel, who, expressly advocates far-right ideologies and monarchism. Like there is a persistent vein there that I think is in need of further exploration. I think that there's a connecting line between some of the things that Mare was just talking about and the way that you sort of rationalize the work. And if technologies are frequently used as a mechanism for control in some larger ideological frame that makes that control make sense.
Ed?
Yeah, no, I think, like you're absolutely right. A lot of those ideas are really important, right? Because there is a very long history to earliest days of Silicon Valley. And I think also, part of it is connected to the ways in which like sectors that are at the frontier and at the top of the American economy are constructed and who gets to rise to the top of them and what things need to happen to rise to the top of them. Part of it is also like where it's situated, right? Silicon Valley, California, these are projects that are steeped in long histories of eugenics, long histories of racism, long histories of imperialism, long histories of extraction, right? Two of my favorite books on really like just California itself. There's Imperial San Francisco, which is a book by Gray Birchen that kind of talks about the impact that mining had in kind of creating the state. and tracing the fortunes that were created, the information empires that were created, also to incentivize people to keep coming back, the ways in which the land was literally exhausted and devastated, and the power and wealth that these people leveraged to wage war elsewhere to replenish the ecology with literal ecological loot, whether it was like stealing trees from the Philippines to, reforest the area around Lake Tahoe, right? Or, rerouting other states' waterways, or dispossessing, stealing, and, the land from indigenous communities. As well as, as Palo Alto's history kind of sketches out, like the fact that a lot of these people are just racist motherfuckers, like really weird racist nerds, really believed that, like, for example, the Palo Alto system from which it gets its name, right, really believed that, like, children should be, like, trained and educated in ways that ensure, like, you're hitting these benchmarks. You're getting these resources to ensure you hit these benchmarks. You're able to reproduce this system so that you can ensure that other people do that. Stepping back and seeing like that system was adopted from a horse breeding farm, and like the largest horse breeding farm that innovated a lot of methods of breeding, where they brought those methods to Stanford. They brought eugenicists to Stanford, and then they're trying to create ubermensch engineers who are going to go forth and revolutionize and disrupt industries, whether that's mining itself, or whether that's the redesign of the cities, or whether that's warfare, or whatever you can apply their intellectual spirit to, right? So I think there's a really long history of the eugenics, of this obsession with productivity, of this desire and drive to reduce humans to things lesser than they are, so that they're easier to categorize, control, profit from, shape, and design, and that this feeds and slots really nicely into the shape and form of the industry as it is today, where, like the primary concern is, what do we do with these data-centric models? Well, we can give them to oil companies. We can give them to militaries. We can give them to states and governments. We can give them to places that are in need of resources as they're trying to, brutalize, terrorize, surveil, and extract from more of the world, right? So there's never been really a period or a change where the people who are rising to the top, the ideas or the methods that are dominant, are not going to be ones that are amicable or amenable with people who believe there's some groups of people that are lesser than other people, and that they're better than them, that there are groups of people who need to be in charge. There are groups of people who need to be designing and be left alone to design these things, either because they're just like that, brazenly concerned with profit, or because they truly believe, for one reason or another, largely the years of damage this work has done to their minds, right? Or their ability to reason about these things, that those with the power and those who got there are the only ones who really understand these things work, right? I mean, like Eric Schmidt is probably like the loudest modern proponent of that, insisting that no one other than engineers, no one other than the computer scientists should ever be allowed to make these decisions. And coincidentally, I also happen to be like running so many of the organizations which might be making some of the rules for this, and I would like that to be the framework that we continue to push forward, right? So I feel like that, it really boils down to a combination of those things that have only gotten worse, right? As the world continues to fray, like Meredith was talking about, as things get worse, the ecology gets worse, prospects for human survival at the hands of the civilizations that dominate it get worse. These people are going to be looting more and hoarding more on the sinking ship, and trying to take more out of the gaping hole with them, instead of like doing anything really to help fix it, because they're the saboteurs, at the end of the day.
For a long, long time now, there have been frequent warnings that automation will destroy, say, half of all jobs in as little as 2 decades' time. And just recently, maybe in the last 2 weeks, McKinsey released a report saying that AI will contribute as much as $4.4 trillion to the global economy annually by automating 60 to 70% of workers' labor time. But this long, recurrently predicted automation apocalypse, as past Dig guest Aaron Benenov writes, just never comes. And there are plenty of reasons, he writes, to think that it won't come this time either. Earlier, we talked about some of the incentives for big tech to oversell AI. Why do they hype automation like this? And do you think that this hype around automation can serve to not only juice present day investments in AI, but also obscure the actual threats posed to workers by AI and by big tech in general?
I mean, McKinsey famously good at predicting correctly. Like a Harvard grad in bed ordering Uber Eats, Googling, what is the economy? I think the story is as important as the mechanism, right? And I know Ed and Sarah have done a lot of work on the gig economy or the sort of computationally mediated degradation of labor. But I think what happened there is a real good object lesson. It wasn't what was when Uber came on the scene. It was presented as a tech company. And as Avina Dubal and others have written really beautifully about this, but it was this is a tech company that's going to innovate taxi work, right? And it's going to do so in a way that has found the formula for mutual benefit. It's more flexible. You make more. You're sort of disrupting a sclerotic industry with medallion corruption, et cetera. And that really focused everyone's attention on sort of technological affordances, right? Like, whoa, this is new. What was actually happening? Like, what allowed them to persist and hollow out the labor protections and sort of domain of delivery and taxi work? It was labor arbitrage, regulatory arbitrage, and the ability to float on venture capital without producing profits for long enough that you kneecap those industries, right? So, in that scenario, there's sort of a magpie's bauble that is distracting us, via compelling, mythologized stories about innovation and computational technology from what's really going on, which is, literally undermining labor law. They are violating labor law. They are routing around regulation, to the point of defrauding regulators. And they're being funded to do so on the premise that they can sustain that long enough to capsize their competition and, take a, if not a monopoly position, at least a dominant position, that has in the meantime degraded work and the lives of the workers who formerly had a more stable source of income and a more pleasant livelihoods. So I think that is a lot of times what you're looking at is a story that serves as an incredible pretext for degrading labor. And I think that the Writers Guild of America strike is another one where you have folks who are being faced with inflated AI hype and mythology, right? Like GPT can take your jobs, can do your creative labor, can, completely eliminate you all as creative workers. We know that's not true. GPT is a sort of, technically speaking, a bullshit engine. It doesn't produce new material. It is not well suited for, creative work. And yet that story is powerful enough that they are on strike facing down studios who would love to do, the same Uber move, which is introduce GPT as, under the pretext that it is capable of doing their jobs. It doesn't matter that it is or not. Let's follow this scenario forward, fire all the writers who have health insurance, benefits, stability, are affiliated with the union, then, put up Writerly, the app where they have to low bid each other every day on some gig economy platform to come back in under the title of an AI editor with no stability, no long-term future, no benefits, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the dynamic that I see here that has very, very little to do with the actual capabilities of the systems that are tasked to automate, and a lot more to do with who gets to tell the story about those systems. Where are we looking when we look at the issues of workplace automation? Are we looking and listening to workers? Are we looking and listening at marketing copy written by tech executives, or are we sort of buying the line that studios or bosses tell us?
Yeah, I mean, Aaron's work is really, it's so great here, right? Aaron has written also about ChatGPT, which I think dovetails really nicely with Meredith's point, right? Where, in 2010, 2013, people were publishing these studies saying, hey, within a decade, maybe even 2 decades, at least half of all our jobs are going to be gone. They're going to be automated away because they're made up of these disaggregated tasks, or tasks that can be disaggregated and assigned to robots or to automated systems. And the time has gone on. Few, if any, of these jobs have been automated away. A lot of the firms that offered these products and services that were supposed to get rid of the jobs have collapsed and crumbled, or have hobbled along, saying that they're going to need more money to investigate even narrower applications, or finding a second wind with the more recent resurgent hype cycle for artificial intelligence that's happening right now, right? And that when you actually dig into it and you see that, a lot of work is not able to be automated, and either because it's a lot more complex, or because the technology that people are future casting and wish casting as replacing them is nowhere near advanced enough to do any of that, right? Still, this is only an inconvenient, fact for people who are pushing the automation technologies, right? Because, like Meredith was talking about, right, this is still going to be a strategy that will be used, right? Because it's under the cover of an inevitable march that we can institute more controlling workplaces and degrade labor conditions and save on labor costs by smashing labor and workers, right? And by ensuring that we have harder boundaries and higher walls between the person doing their work and their ability to control it. And then also the ability to use any control of that work to have any effect on what the corporation itself is doing, right? And I think that what you'll see in the coming years is attempts to constantly re-scramble and say this or that or the third is going to be automated away. And when you see these massive layoffs, part of this is also similar to how venture capitalists try to make hype cycles real by just throwing money at it and inflating the valuations and hoping more comes. The layoffs might serve a similar function, or attempts at layoffs may serve a similar function, with saying, well, we're going to get rid of these jobs. We're going to restructure our labor around automating or among products that are supposedly automating away the labor. But then, as, for example, Slack just did, trying to rehire these workers in a new scheme or a new structure of labor where what they're doing is something that is either their old job, or a more wasteful, complicated version of it, where they are, being involved in moderating and watching and ensuring that the supposedly automated system that was able to replace them doesn't go off the rails, right? These attempts to make it real are much more important than actually figuring out what way they could be used to augment and amplify and make human labor better, right? Because the concern isn't any of that, that's all the bullshit, right? The real concern is, how do we generate more profits in one way or another? And how do we preserve power, control, and autonomy, right? How do we preserve this absolutist structure? How do we crush workers and ensure that they don't have autonomy? How do we ensure that things go more along our lines than not? And I think that's really like what's going to be the real story that happens, because I feel like more workplaces that still try to do it, they'll roll out this AI, they won't get the results, right? Like the example that Meredith used with the workers, with the writers. I mean, what's the predictable consequence going to be, right? They'll just spill, if the studios win and they're able to use AI, what they're calling AI for writing these things and for pitting workers together and degrading their quality, the working conditions, they'll also decline the quality of the content. And there's a big question if you can continue to do that and still expect audiences and these platforms to persist, right? We're already scraping the barrel, right? Streaming there's not been a clear path to profitability, right? Or to the explosive profits that these people anticipated for streaming. And this is after they've done and successfully eroded away more and more of the pre-existing system that preserved good conditions, that were high labor costs for these studios trying to squeeze out more money, and also provided better, and helped ensure better content, right? So what's going to happen if you continue to try to automate it away? You might make more money in the short term, maybe by having to pay the writers less and having to provide less for them, but you might lose more in the long term by providing shit and garbage, which no one wants to consume anymore, and which then undermines the logic for the entire system. So I don't know. I feel like, I feel like, if you were a good capitalist and you would step back and look at it and say, this is a delicate tightrope, let's not go down this line, but, they're not. So, so this is what we get.
Sarah?
I mean, I think it is worth talking about what some of the changes that have unfolded in terms of the nature of working conditions and the relationship between workers and employers to there's, the, significant increase in information asymmetries between workers and employers that is attributable to the deployment of workplace surveillance and algorithmic management techniques, that it's much harder to document the harms because of the individualization and the atomization of work. So let's say if you're discriminated against, it can be harder to identify the patterns and the other people who are experiencing the same kind of discrimination if it's occurring over some sort of platform-based model. There's also, I think, a real uptick in the blurring of boundaries between, working life and home life. This is happening at the level of devices. If you have to download an app on your phone for work, does that then mean that your employer can extend their reach onto your personal device through surveillance? I think these are questions that I think we need to be asking and paying particular attention to, because they significantly shape the power relationships between workers and employers. And if we're going to retain any space for building worker power, for being able to effectively organize, it's important to also preserve space where you're not going to be surveilled by your boss, and where you have, a sense of who you're organizing against. It's not sort of like this dispersed app-based market, but I don't know. There's a lot of complicated elements that are introduced through technology that need to be part of the discussion. I mean, one other thing, I always want to talk about this company, Argyle, which advertises itself as the data broker for workers' data. So they just have these massive data sets that have been collected on workers that are available for sale. And how does that then get used out in the world? Vina Dubal has written about the introduction of algorithmic wage management and the personalization of a wage to what is the lowest that they think that they can pay you and get away with. There's a lot to mine, I think, beyond the basic questions of, will jobs be automated away and how will work be devalued? That also gets at, how are working conditions being changed in ways that diminish workers' autonomy and ability to organize, and the need to really agitate against that.
I can say there would be no labor organizing at Google if we didn't have Signal, full stop. And I think that brings us to a point that's maybe obvious, but worth stressing. AI technologies, when deployed, are surveillance technologies. So we can't cleave the privacy discourse and the concern over, surveillance and information asymmetries that constitute power asymmetries from the AI discourse. It doesn't matter whether you're collecting information about where I am located in the world because, I'm pinging a cell tower that you're able to triangulate to my location with some degree of accuracy, or if you are inferring where I am in the world based on a predictive model that has scraped sort of other metadata and made a, educated guess, whether right or wrong, around where I am. So, whether or not the data produced about me, my colleagues, myself as a type of person, it, comes through a predictive model and is sort of inference, or whether that data is collected in ways that we are more comfortable describing as surveillant, like my library records or, scan my mail. At the end of the day, that data becomes data about me that constitutes a power asymmetry. And, again, the authority and information is in the hands of, those who already have power. So this is employers or educators or police, and generally deployed in their interests, and the interests of employers are extracting as much as possible from workers.
And would be remiss if we didn't also note that like so much of what we know about the capabilities of AI and so much of the meaningful contestation of, stopping AI systems that would harm people from going out in the world is the product of worker-led organizing. So there is a sort of recursive function here where we need to preserve space for worker-led organizing to be able to continue without AI-driven mechanisms of control, and also much of what we know and are able to contest about the deployments of AI is the product of that very same labor organizing.
Speaking of workers, aside from the already very rich people like Sam Altman and Eric Schmidt getting even richer, there is indeed a globally distributed labor force of people working often for very low wages who make these giant profits possible. Who is the working class that's making these large language models that are the basis of so-called AI technology? What's the nature of the work? What does it entail? And Sarah, referring back to your last comment, what have we seen promising signs of labor organization amongst that growing workforce?
Yeah, I mean, we have the moderators who were responsible for labeling the training data that was used to build ChatGPT and GPT-4 formed the African Content Moderators Union, I think a month or two ago. So there is, I think, quite promising labor activity. There was also a really important precedent in the Amsterdam Court of Appeals recently where Uber and Lyft drivers brought a case under the GDPR and were successfully able to, get the court ruling that the GDPR applies to Uber and Lyft's use of automated firing technologies. Those are not compliant with the GDPR, and that the GDPR also applies to their use of algorithmic wage setting technologies. So there's been a number of different fronts where organizing by the so-called working class around AI has had real wins, and I think they're important fronts to look to. I realize I answered the last question and didn't get into like what is the nature of this work. I don't know if Mara, Ed want to take it. I'm happy to keep talking, but
the intelligence that is attributed to the machine is people.
Yeah.
Spoiler. Yeah. And those people in, classic fashion are very frequently low paid workers in the majority world who are employed to affix labels to images, to catalog text snippets, or to otherwise organize the data that informs AI models into legible snippets that then allow the AI model to be met, to meet new data, a new prompt or a new query, and statistically predict what an answer might be based on the labels, based on the categories, based on the intelligence that has been imparted by these workers. So it's workers all the way down, and there is a, largely invisibilized, although many people have been working to draw attention to this workforce. There's a large workforce that needs to, not only label training data and sort of, catalog it in a way that can be, quote unquote, absorbed by these systems, but also needs to continually nudge and prompt and constrain these systems so that they can fit into the norms of polite liberal discourse, right? You can't be licensing a system to a large corporation that is terribly prone at spitting out hate speech. And we know, these systems are trained on data that is collected from the internet, on generally English language data, on, it's pretty gnarly, right? And without that training, without that kind of culling and disciplinary function that these workers provide, these systems would not be marketable or profitable. And that's a forever job in many cases. So it's, it's people, it's labor, it's dead labor. It's probably not a surprise to a lot of this audience, but that's, the sleight of hand at the core of this contestation of intelligence is that, ultimately the ground truth that informs these models on, how to interpret, the prompts and data they are given is provided by this huge and unheralded workforce.
Ed.
And that division of labor is like a, that is because the industry is so fervently dedicated to building out this massive Chinese room, right? This massive sort of like black box where it goes in, it comes out, it appears as if it understands or simulates understanding, but in reality it doesn't, because there is no, actual interiority there. It requires that, okay, well, if we believe that what you need to do is to feed it as much information as possible, as much data as possible, build increasingly larger and larger data sets so it can glean larger and larger statistical inferences about reality, and models that simulate this or that part of cognition, and eventually will make a mind, right? Well, you can't do that here because the labor is too expensive and the politics are complicated, and other competitors might have an easier time replicating the model and then push you out so you lose it, right? So you got to take it elsewhere, right? And this is the model for so much of the valley as well, right? So much of this is extractivist logic, where not only do we take the resources, the raw materials, as cheaply as possible, but the labor, whenever it's possible, is used, right? I mean, the labor in building a lot of the technical implements that require then the intelligence to be cloaked and made into ghost work, right? Also have to rely on, basically paying workers as little as possible, and in some instances just, having slavery, right? And the consequences being, well, one, kind of like, tricking the public into thinking, hey, like we've got this intelligence, but the artifice is actually separating the person from it and presenting the machine as the intelligent thing. But two, also forcing these people into these horrible conditions where, sometimes they're doing content moderation on images that are abhorrent, or they're also doing just like, such horrible, unthinking, numbing task, right? Tasks that make you think of like Adam Smith's critique of division of labor, talking about how like, human beings should not be like capitalism. One way to look at capitalism and its disregard for humans is to look at how one of the best ways, right, to produce productivity and profits is to organize people into such demeaning tasks where they're not really thinking through something and where they're totally divorced from whatever it is they're creating or contributing to, when a core drive of human beings is creation in some measure, some connection to whatever the product of your labor is, right? And so on like a multitude of levels, right? This is also something that empowers and reinforces all the problematic values and essence of the valley, right? Because it's happening on this area with using data and the intelligence of workers. It's also happening in other places with raw materials and with assembling of products as well. And in both instances, if something happens to the worker, it's obscured as much as possible. It doesn't really matter, because the real thing that matters is transmuting this human being into a machine so that you can convince other human beings to give you or support your efforts to, clear out more space, get more autonomy, more control over the rest of the process, so you can get more resources to try to build more of these machines and convince more people that they're actually intelligent, or that they actually should, acquiesce and let more and more of daily life be organized by them and others that they're interested in working with, right? If they could have their way, I'm sure they would try to replicate this everywhere, but they're not going to be able to, of course. And so that's why most of these efforts get relegated to or limited to the global south.
This brings us to the inevitable what is to be done question. How should government deal with AI? And maybe more importantly, given the state of things and the state of, the left vis-a-vis the state, what demands should our unions, our movements, our organizations be making around it? Should some iterations of it simply be banned? Should others be regulated? Should antitrust deal with it? Should it be socialized, whatever that would mean? What is or what are the solutions?
Given that AI is this messy shibboleth deployed as a marketing term, I think there are two ways to answer that question. The first is simply that the people who are most at risk of harm from AI, the workers, the students, the people who are in cages, the criminalized folks, should have the most say over whether it's used or whether these data-centric predictive technologies that are predicated on one or another type of centralized control and perspective should be deployed in any arena. And then if so, how, right? And we don't have anything near that right now. But one of the reasons the WGA strike is so heartening to me is that is the texture of those demands. And it is the front lines, in my view, of the regulatory fight around AI. And it's a regulatory fight that has the benefit of not having swarms of OpenAI lobbyists, constantly in the room, sort of directing the perspectives of the regulators. I think the other answer there, that is an answer that sort of takes into account the variegated deployment environments and the fact that these technologies are, marketed and applied in such vastly different contexts that it's very hard to have, a single answer that is specific to, the technology and needs to really take into account the risks and context. I think there is also just sort of the simple answer of, recognize that AI is not a product of novel innovation in the current moment. It is the product of concentrated monopoly power. And so you attack that concentrated power. And I know that Sarah and Amba Kok and their colleagues at AI Now have thought a lot about what is an evidence-based and practical regulatory agenda that looks particularly at this concentration of power, at the tools available or potentially available to tackle it, and how would we use those to reduce that power, to redistribute that power, and to introduce some modicum of democratic decision making into the questions around whether technology, and if so, how.
Sarah.
I want to co-sign Mayor's emphasis on people having the scope for determination around the way that AI is being used to affect their lives. I think that that's something that's been broadly missing from discussions around AI that impute a sense of inevitability, or that there is sort of this arms race. And if we don't do it, then someone else will do it around this technology. I think that needs to be at the forefront. Looking to the policy space, I think bringing an analysis of the structural, infrastructural power of big tech firms also needs to be front and center. The reason why I think we at AI Now have focused often on antitrust or competition interventions is because that is a mechanism that acknowledges the harmful effects of concentrated economic power and offers some leverage points that get at the business model, at the reasons for structural dominance and modes for dismantling it. And so, that's one locus, but broadly taking on, bright line measures that curb the most harmful uses that may be in the form of, banning certain categories of technology writ large. We're already seeing that, by the way. In the EU AI Act, there are bans on predictive policing, bans on emotion recognition. In the Parliament version of the AI Act draft, we'll see if it makes it into the final version, but we're already there. And I think, getting out of the frame that sort of places the work of seeking accountability on the broader public, and put more of the burden on the companies that are benefiting from and gaining profit from these technologies. I think frameworks that sort of attend to those power dimensions, I think, are also really key here.
To that what is to be done question, right? I think there are two large things, right? There's of course the policy stuff. What do we do in the immediacy, and what do we do in a larger sense? And I want to start with that because I feel like there's a huge question where a lot of the discussions, debates, thoughts about what AI should or shouldn't look like still in one way are kind of accepting the terrain of everything else. We don't seem to be too interested in doing anything other than how do we use AI to plug into a better operation of states, of markets, and all the configurations and arrangements that exist right now. Instead of thinking about how, another way to put it, what do we want our technology to do? Do we want our technology to just optimize and make more efficient human relations in the type of institutions we have today, or do we want to use it as part of the creative process and potential we all have to develop new things, right? And to maybe break the hold of other things that exist right now. whether it be markets, whether it be states, whether it be the geopolitics that dominate the world, or whether it be, this, that, or the third, right? Do we want to figure out ways of collaboration that are outside of markets, that are outside of startups, that are outside of, narrow vehicles that exist now, aligned with capitalist interests, right? Which is not to say AI will institute digital socialism, but to a larger point, most of our questions and debates and thoughts about technology, because of how thoroughly it's dominated by capitalists, are really only concerned with things on their terms, right? And so what is to be done is like a constant contesting of this idea that when we're using or thinking about automated systems, they should only be used to make sure you eke out 5% more revenue, profits, gains, used to corral workers, used to amplify killing machines, as opposed to just like experiments with what they can and can't be used for. But we can't do that, to return to the policy side, we can't do that as long as it is thoroughly dominated by like warmongers and military contractors and surveillance firms and all the sort of parasites that, left to their own devices, would make a nightmare tech that would doom the rest of us to a life, where we're just generating as much profit for them as possible, right? And I think Meredith and Sarah outlined a lot of really key policy interventions, right? Because it boils down to, we got to ban a lot of this shit. We got to take control and seize control of a lot of the infrastructure and contest their control of it. We have to lock them out of ever getting back into these things also. And we have to, whenever possible, reduce the size of markets so we can drown them or destroy them completely, as part of this larger attempt to shift control of computational infrastructure and resources from private to public control, because it's only once we free it from these private demands and interests that we can really start to experiment with literally everything else that we should have been experimenting with from the start of this.
Meredith Whittaker, Ed Ongweso, and Sarah West, thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. It's been a delight.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it was really great.
That was Meredith Whittaker, Ed Ongweso, and Sarah West. Meredith Whittaker is a scholar and longtime tech worker whose work examines the political economy and social implications of computational technology and the industry that controls it. Edward Ongweso Jr. is a freelance writer based in Brooklyn who covers labor, finance, and technology. He's the co-host of This Machine Kills, a podcast about the political economy of technological innovation. Sarah Myers West is the managing director of the AI Now Institute and the author of the forthcoming book, Tracing Code, which examines the origins of commercial surveillance. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that the working population produces both the accumulation of capital and the means by which it has made itself relatively superfluous, and it does this to an extent which is always increasing. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. We are recorded at WBRU in Providence. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinators are Tamuz Frankel and Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Thea Rio Francos and Ben Mabey. A huge thanks to Ben Tarnoff and Moira Weigel for helping me prep this interview. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Check out our vast archives at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter at thedigradio and find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this podcast. If it's on iTunes, also rate and review us. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners. But what really does that is you telling other people to check out the pod. Please make propaganda for us and do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly contribution to help keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks a month is huge.